now is the time for me to finally get around to my number one pick in my idiosyncratic top 10 horror. Welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. My friend the Rainbow Circle. Um, I've been trying to come up with a new thing to say about the nature of narratives with each of the 10, which is a little bit of a struggle. Because if I'm picking 10 that I genuinely love, and they also follow these other criteria, they're not on anybody else's list. They're not part of the canon. They're not ironic or obscure just for the sake of sounding cool. Um, how do I also find something interesting to say about each one that will enlighten us about the nature of narratives? But of course, for my number one, I have to pick The Void, um, which is one of my favorite recent movies, one of my favorite movies of all time, maybe. Um, but and it's a highly personal movie for me because I had a real hard year, real hard 2 years, and so really in January ish of last year, um, through the entirety of the year, um, I watched The Void a lot of different times, and it was very comforting. Um, which is one of those things that um, is a weird concept, and I think that is something that's enlightening to. I think that's something that's enlightening to just the nature of narrative. The idea that The Void is a very very comforting movie for me, um, and it's highly personal as well. And I think that's something that really undermines just the nature of how we assess value in stories and literature and movies and what have you. It kind of undermines just the role of the critic as the arbiter of taste and quality and universal good and universal bad. Because The Void is just a little independent movie, very small budget. It's extremely gory. It's kind of a Lovecraftian tale of it's got touches of The Evil Dead, another very comforting movie, series. It's got touches of all kinds of other movies. It's clearly influenced by, it's these people get these diseases and they start turning into these biomorphs, these monstrous biomorphs. There's a cult with triangle faces. Um, there's a dimensional portal into a world full of pyramids. It's just a fun movie, and it gave me such joy in a really really hard time. But um, who's to say if I said, objectively, the best horror movie is The Shining or Psycho or Night of the Living Dead or Suspiria or something like that. Um, they're clearly better than The Void. Which one has given me the most personal joy in recent years? Really, which one has given me the most personal joy? Oh, it's The Void, honestly. How is that any different than if I said The Shining? Would I be saying that because everybody says that? I love The Shining, but would I be saying that because to gain credibility because everybody says that, or would I be picking Suspiria because that's the cool choice? I love Suspiria, but is that why I would be picking it? You know, but The Void I know is untainted by that because I've seen that on nobody's list. Maybe like the best movies of recent years under such and such a budget, maybe. But I think that's the most valid takeaway of that is just there's no universal good, only just personal enjoyment. And whether or not it is tainted by conformity to common standards, that's still a valid criteria for identifying something as also personally good. Do I enjoy Suspiria because I know it's the cool choice? Does that actually enhance my enjoyment? Is that a pure honest enjoyment? Yeah, it could be. Um, and that's totally valid. But I think just the whole notion that horror movies in generally are comforting um, is an odd notion that is really revealing about just the nature of narrative. And this bowling pin. One reason I wanted to shoot here is because of this bowling pin randomly in the background. That's from a Halloween costume where I was Daniel Plainview from There Would Be Blood. There Would Be Blood, beautiful, beautiful movie, intensely complicated character study. Daniel Day-Lewis is amazing. It's essentially a horror movie, honestly. Let's face it. The bowling pin scene is the climax of a horror movie scene of a horror movie. It's a scene that you would see at the end of a horror movie. Why not? And that kind of distinction is irrelevant. There Would Be Blood is an art movie. It's not a horror movie, even though the climax is a horror movie climax. But There Will Be Blood is a tagline from, I think it was Saw 2. It's a tagline from one of the Saw movies. And in my previous episode, I mentioned how the Saw movies are misunderstood and underappreciated for their narrative complexity and their deep level character analysis. What really separates the Saw movies from There Will Be Blood? Nothing, if you ask me. I was just reading an article about how all the superhero movies are vapid, but what really makes them vapid? What does vapid even mean? They have shallow characters. Well, if you love the characters, you would see how they're not shallow. If you don't love the characters, all you see is the shallow qualities. A lot of that is just purely arbitrary. But the Saw movies are comforting. And I had so many honorable mentions. I was looking through the list of possibilities, like Midnight Meat Train. Midnight Meat Train wouldn't be number one, but I do love Midnight Meat Train. That's my favorite, my second favorite Bradley Cooper movie, or third after the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, as Rocket Raccoon. I like it a whole lot more than Silver Linings Playbook is a great movie, but it's I like Midnight Meat Train better. Why? I don't know. I just enjoy it. It's very. It's very enjoyable on so many levels. A Repo the Genetic Opera, very cheesy. It's a musical horror movie, very cheesy, but cheesy is not a universal bad. I still love it. It's very sentimental, very melodramatic. It has Paris Hilton in it. I still love it. Do I have bad taste? Oh, who cares? What can I take out of it that's valuable to me personally? That's much more important. And there was this movie that I never saw on anybody's list, but it's such an interesting movie called The Invitation, which is a horror movie. It doesn't appear to be that way at first. But is that more artistic because it's subtler? There's nothing subtle about Repo the Genetic Opera. Another Darren Lynn Bousman. I like Darren Lynn Bousman movies, clearly. There's nothing subtle about Repo the Genetic Opera. There's a lot more subtle stuff going on in The Invitation. If you put those two side by side, I really love both of those. Radically different movies. But what sort of universal can you take out of that? Is it that character studies are better than, intense violence? I don't know if that's the universal. Subtlety is better than overt cheesiness and violence. That's entirely personal. But the thing about The Void, I found it comforting, and that's the key. I talked to you a little bit about, The Human Centipede. My brother saw The Human Centipede, and it said it was the grossest movie, and it's so shocking. And the first Human Centipede, I watched it, and I was like, yeah, it's okay. I'm not that disturbed by it. Maybe that's something wrong with my head. I have no idea. But then I saw Human Centipede 2, and I said, oh, yeah, there you go. That's the right balance of everything. But the Human Centipede 1 is, it's so much more tame than the marketing made it seem. They're psychologically disturbing things for sure, but, it's definitely not as graphic as the trailer made it seem. Number 2 is very, very graphic. Number 3 is just wacky and over the top, and it's much more tongue-in-cheek and ironic in so many ways, and so like the graphic stuff just doesn't hit. So number 1, a lot more subtle than it was marketed as. Number 3, way over the top and tongue-in-cheek and all that sort of stuff. So both of those kind of compromise the impact of the actual gore itself. I would say number one has more psychological impact. But number two sort of has that balance. But that's a very personal thing. I mean, it's, I'm desensitized to that kind of stuff. Um, and so The Void is, very, very gory, very graphic. But I'm desensitized to it. It doesn't hit the same way. So it's just, that's what makes it comforting. So if you reference the rainbow circle, this end is the comfort. If I can contort the right way. And this is visceral stimulation. So something that's just graphic should be viscerally stimulating, but if you deaden the nerve, basically, then it can become comforting, or it can turn the reader off and make the reader turn away, or the viewer turn away. And that's a highly personal thing, because I've seen so many of these types of movies. It doesn't hit the same way. And that's just the nature of critics as well. A critic will say, I haven't heard criticism, but a critic will say, the invitation is great because it's so subtle. But when you watch just a lot of art movies, next to a lot of really commercial movies, you'll see a lot of the same sort of things showing up in the commercial movies, sort of deaden your response to it. So if somebody does something new in an art movie, it increases importance. But that's really entirely audience-based, the audience of the critic himself or herself. But then you also have, genre conventions. So if you said, if you had a literary critic and you gave them a bunch of romance novels, they will say, well, all these romance novels are the same. But if you gave romance novels to hardcore romance novel fan, they would say, yeah, they're the same, but it's comforting. I enjoyed that particular story so much that it gives me a very different type of joy than just having something that's really novel, a novel that's really novel. So if you had like a romance novel that did something just radically different, if you had, it seems like a romance novel at first, and then it's swerved, they don't end up together at the end, or some sort of element of the trope of the romance novels, it's comes at a surprise. It comes as a surprise, and it's discomforting. The reader can view that as something that's bad, even though it's not necessarily universally bad. It's just it disrupts that comfort. And a lot of that has to do with balance based on the experience of the reader. So for me, looking at The Void, it hits the right balance for me of familiarity and novelty. And it's not that balance is even the universal, but for me as an individual, the elements of familiarity and novelty of this type of movie. If you've seen Evil Dead, you'd be familiar with essentially what's going on in The Void. So it's familiar, but it's also viscerally stimulating because of just the imagery is just by nature viscerally stimulating. So it has that right comfort of familiarity and visceral stimulation. Is that, can you identify a universal good or bad from that particular dynamic? Well, no, not really. It's highly individualistic. So how do you take the views of critics as universal and applying to common audiences? Well, clearly you can't do that. How do you take a story and give it to a creative writing workshop and get anything actually genuinely valuable from that based on the variety of different personal experiences and tastes of people in the audience? And if you take that seriously, you're bound to default to the bland center. You're bound to default to a compromise of what makes it outside of a particular individual's taste. So, if I submitted The Void to a workshop, for example, and I said, what should I change about that? And somebody said, it's too gory. I don't like gore, and it's too gory, so I should make it less gory. And then they justify that. with a post-rationalization, which is one of the big problems with this particular approach. Post-rationalization. Somebody sees gore, just personally dislikes gore, and says through post-rationalization, it's wrong because the gore distances the audience. Well, it's just a post-rationalization. That's not really a universal. And I said, okay, I'll cut back on the gore. Or I need a closer connection with the characters, and that's a universal. Well, just the nature of horror is you have the right balance of connection with the characters, so that the stimulation takes on the character of horror movies and not of tragedies. So I want to write a horror movie. I don't want to write a tragedy. So I have to really strike a really effective balance with the connection with the characters. But if somebody's reading that who enjoys a tragic story and does not enjoy a horror story and says, I don't feel enough connection with the characters to care about them, and so I'll change the void so that we have this whole backstory of the characters. Commonly what will happen, and this is something that drives me crazy, just part of the delight of the void, is it doesn't explain a lot, which is great. That's perfect. I personally love when a horror movie doesn't explain anything, really. What makes The Shining so great? You have whole movies about explaining The Shining from various perspectives. So when a horror movie leaves things ambiguous, it stimulates on a whole different level. Excuse me, goodness. The worst part of the Psycho is the 10 minutes of explaining Norman Bates. Psycho's an amazing movie, but nobody comes out of Psycho and says, my favorite part was when the doctor explained what Norman Bates was, what was behind his dressing up like his mother. But anyway, so the void just doesn't explain anything if there's a void of explanation. What if I submitted that and people said, I don't understand the cult. You never explained the cult with the triangle faces. So what? What if I explained it and gave that a whole backstory? What I enjoy about the void would then be absolutely ruined. I would ruin the void completely by actually listening to these people who may not naturally be fans of the void. The void is kind of, for me personally, the perfect balance of the perfect elements that I can just rewatch over and over again. I personally would not change just a thing about the void. But, somebody who wouldn't naturally be a fan of it. And I can totally understand that. I mean, it's not a movie that everyone will love. It is very gory in a particular way, and it is, very ambiguous in a particular way. I think it's just tons of fun. And I wouldn't expect anyone to feel that precise based on what other people have watched. If you've never watched a horror movie before, I wouldn't give you The Void as your first one to watch. If you're not used to gore, I wouldn't give you The Void as one to watch. I'd give you a much lighter one so you get used to it. And then, gradually building up to The Void, So if I just submitted The Void blind to a bunch of people who may or may not be fans of the same type of movie, that ultimately renders their opinion on it irrelevant, really. And, that particular situation tends to, and I've talked about this before, it tends to imitate just the dynamic of something having been published. And so, the sort of blind submission to workshopping really imitates, post-publication sort of responses, which are still ultimately irrelevant. If I made The Void and critics said, well, this is terrible, I wouldn't care. It's not your movie. I don't really care what you think. If somebody who's a hardcore horror fan who just loves that type of movie said, it was perfect, like me. If it was perfect, it was perfect. It's the perfect balance of all these different things that I definitely want in a movie. It brought me so much joy just in the nature of it. somebody like that, I would say, yeah, I mean, you like this kind of movie, you're used to this kind of movie, therefore your perspective, I find it very valuable. But just that sort of blind context void, no pun intended, of submitting, something that you just genuinely, a very, very particular type of story that you love and enjoy writing and reading. I wouldn't expect everyone to take the same thing out of it, and that it's absurd to think anyone would. But anyway, go see The Void. I guess that's my main point. If you like that type of movie, definitely see The Void. If you don't like that type of movie, you're probably not gonna like it, and that's okay. Never be ashamed to love what you love. I love just ridiculous, ridiculous movies. See you in the next episode.